Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's disability information video. This week we're going to be talking about traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury results from an impact to the head that disrupts normal brain function. So a traumatic brain injury may affect a person's cognitive abilities, including learning and thinking skills. These injuries are most often caused by events where one hits their head hard, such as falls, being struck by an object, or often motor vehicle accidents. So these are high impact injuries that strike the head with a big force all at once. So it just causes some internal damage. So, but there's some other causes for traumatic brain injuries as well. For example, it can also be caused by indirect forces that shake the brain violently inside the head, such as shock waves from a battle explosion, which could, launch the body and you could hit your head, or you could just have your brain being shook very hard by the shock waves from the explosions. So that's another potential cause for a brain injury. And then another one can also be another cause could be bullet wounds or other injuries that actually penetrate the skull, causing damage that way. So the core aspect of a traumatic brain injury is damage to the brain caused by some sort of injury. So traumatic brain injuries can range in severity from mild to severe, depending on whether the injury causes unconsciousness, how long the unconsciousness lasts, and the severity of the symptoms that arise from the brain injury. So you can have traumatic brain injuries that result from an impact that doesn't lead to the loss in consciousness. However, injuries that result in a loss of consciousness are generally considered to be more severe. So if you get a brain injury that leads you to become unconscious, it's more likely to be a severe injury that has more symptoms that affect an individual's daily living in more impactful ways. So mild traumatic brain injuries basically result when the unconsciousness lasts for less than 30 minutes. And then a moderate traumatic brain injury, this occurs when unconsciousness lasts for greater than 30 minutes but less than 24 hours. So you're knocked out for a pretty significant period of time on an account of this heavy impact injury, but it's not longer than 24 hours. So that's sort of a moderate injury. And then a severe traumatic brain injury occurs when unconsciousness lasts for greater than 24 hours. So basically, when we're talking about traumatic brain injury, the symptoms are generally pretty sort of similar for a mild, a moderate, or a severe head injury. They just differ in intensity or how pronounced they are. So someone with a more severe brain injury is going to have more severe symptoms. And someone with a less severe brain injury is going to have less severe symptoms. But the symptoms themselves are largely the same based on what I've discovered in my research. In terms of health effects of traumatic brain injuries, there's sort of a threat to cognitive health in two main ways. So the direct effects of traumatic brain injuries can include unconsciousness, inability to recall the traumatic event. So oftentimes, when someone hits their head, you'll have someone asking them basic questions, who you are, where are you, what year is it? And when it's when the person is injured and it's just hit their head, it's sometimes the case that they can't recall these basic details. And when you hit your head hard enough, it can also lead to an inability to recall the traumatic event. There can also be things like confusion, difficulty learning and remembering new information, trouble speaking coherently, unsteadiness, lack of coordination, and problems with vision or hearing. Some traumatic brain injuries also can increase the long-term risk of developing Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. So recent research has actually found that certain heavy impact sports, such as football or boxing, actually put athletes at a much higher risk for developing certain forms of dementia later in life. So they've suggested that these sports may be more unsafe than previously thought because of the long-term impacts to our brain's health. So I think that's important information to share. And I also want to talk a bit more about how the symptoms for a brain injury can be expressed. And the important point I want to emphasize here is the fact that brain damage is located and related to the specific area of the brain that is damaged, and damage to specific areas of the brain lead to different impairments depending on the damage. So a traumatic brain injury can lead to many different impairments depending on which part of the brain is injured. And that's interesting because it shows us that specific functions of our brain, or specific cognitive tasks or abilities and specific skills, are localized in certain portions of our brain. For example, in other videos, I've talked a lot about different disabilities which result from damage to parts of the brain. For example, cerebral palsy is damage to the motor cortex in your brain, whereas something like a language disorder might be caused by damage to the language portion of your brain. So basically what I'm trying to convey is that damage to specific areas of the brain lead to different impairments depending on where the damage is located and whether that brain area is associated with, or which cognitive functions that brain area is associated with. So I have a bit of an interesting case study to kind of highlight this fact and kind of emphasize how important the localization of brain structures and damage to localized areas of the brain is in terms of causing which symptoms are actually expressed by the person. But I'm just going to give a bit of a warning. The story I'm about to share, it has a bit of graphic content and does contain a injury that some people might find unsettling. So I'm just going to give that as a disclaimer before I move on and describe the case study I want to discuss. So now with that disclaimer out of the way, I want to introduce the case of a very famous case study in psychology, which is the case of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage is famous because he was the subject of a workplace accident. He was a railway worker, so he was working on building just a railway, and I believe on the day when he got injured, he was packing a rock full of dynamite to explode it so they could clear a path for the railway. But what happened was that someone distracted him and he accidentally set off the explosion before he was ready. So what happened was that the explosion actually drove a railway spike straight through beneath his chin and straight out of the top of his head. So the spike went straight through his brain, and it went straight through his brain. But surprisingly and luckily, Phineas Gage did not die. The spike went straight through his head, but he survived. In fact, he was walking and talking within minutes of having the railway spike pass directly through his head. So that seems pretty strange. And the reality was, according to eyewitness testimony of the case, and this case was quite a while ago. It's one of the founding cases in psychology, one of the most important cases in psychology. So I believe it happened in the late 1800s, but I don't know for sure. But basically, Gage seemed okay at first, as I already mentioned. He was walking and talking within minutes, and so basically everyone kind of was confused because they thought he seemed okay by all measurable qualities. Like he was walking and talking, even though a railway spike had gone straightly through his head. But in fact, Gage did suffer consequences from the injury that emerged later. So I'll share a bit of a quote from Gage's employers. So apparently, or I believe it was a researcher commenting on what the employers were saying. So what was remarked about Phineas Gage was that he was initially regarded as one of the most efficient and capable foremen. So he was very good at his job. But his employer considered the change in his mind so marked that they could not give him his job back. His mind was so radically changed, so decidedly changed, that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. So really what happened to Phineas Gage was not necessarily a change in certain cognitive abilities like movement or speech or things like that. What changed was actually his personality. So this case kind of highlights, because the railway spike only affected specific areas of his brain, most of his brain was intact and functional, but a very specific aspect of Phineas, his personality, was actually affected by the specific and localized brain damage. So the case of Phineas Gage and other cases like Phineas Gage where people receive damage to specific portions of their brain have been really instrumental in psychology for helping us to discover where certain brain functions are localized. Basically what I'm saying is that brain injury is one of the instrumental ways that psychologists have started to understand the brain at a deeper level, because they have been instrumental in allowing us to identify which areas of the brain are associated with specific functions. Because when a person receives damage to a part of their brain and they lose functioning in a specific area of their life, we can then say that damaged portion of their brain is what was driving their functionality. And so the damage to that brain is the only real explanation for the loss of functioning. So this I think helps highlight the importance of brain injury cases in psychology, but it also helps highlight how brain injuries can affect everyone differently, depending on which specific area of the brain is actually damaged. So now that we kind of have covered what brain injuries are and how they work, we can now move on into the next portion of our discussion on this topic, which will be an interview with someone with lived experience. I'll see you there in a couple moments. Hello everyone, and welcome to the interview portion of this week's disability information video. Joining me this week is Tina Suter, who owns and manages BRAIN, which is an acronym that I'm not very good at remembering, but I'm hoping Tina can describe for you guys.
That's an acronym for Brain Resource Advocacy and Information Network.
Fantastic. So she's a professional in her field, and she's also here to answer a couple questions from her perspective about how having a brain injury might affect one's life. So I've got a couple questions for Tina, and we're just going to go through them together. So my first question for you, Tina, is what are two aspects of your life that having a brain injury affects that other people might not know or think about?
Okay. I think the first thing is that most folks that have survived a brain injury, and we refer to ourselves as survivors, don't look any different than anyone else. Unless there is an extra physical impairment that comes along with the brain injury, we walk and talk and look the same as everyone else. So folks will not recognize that we have a brain injury. So it's basically a hidden form of disability in a lot of cases. That's one very important aspect. The second one is that when folks or normies hear the term brain injury, they will automatically assume that there's some form of intellectual impairment. Never. the intelligence is never, ever affected by a brain injury. What does occur is differences in cognition. So there'll be cognitive impairment quite often, but never, ever is the intelligence ever affected. So that's
yeah. Awesome, thank you. So yeah, I would imagine that, having something that's a bit hidden from people's actual visual gaze it can create some challenges when people aren't empathetic in understanding that you have some challenges. So yeah, thank you for sharing those. My second question for you is, what have been two of the most important things for you in managing a brain injury?
For myself and also for my peeps, number one is support. Knowing that you're not alone, that someone's got your back, also that someone understands where you're coming from. A lot of folks, as a survivor, become alienated from their families, their friends, their whole life changes. So support from peers, from other folks that actually get where you're coming from, I think is extremely important. And same for the family members. Mutual support through the family members, mutual support through friends of survivors, mutual support through caregivers of survivors as well, is the number one most important thing. And the second most important thing would be information and resources, relevant information and resources. That's the first thing usually I hear from people is, I finally found you, but it took so long to find you. It's so hard to find help or to find any kind of resources that are going to be applicable or appropriate for me.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I would imagine it's very difficult when you kind of wake up with this brain injury and it's like, well, who's going to help me? How do I figure this out? So having those information networks in place is, I would imagine, very important. And I think that's a good place where you come in with your organization.
Absolutely. And that's when and if folks can find us, right? Because a lot of folks may not have the ability to reach out and find assistance or help, right? So quite often I'll get family members that will come to me for help with their survivor.
Yeah, absolutely.
They will reach out. They do the reaching out because the survivor doesn't know where to start or how to even get started, right?
Yeah, I imagine it's just a very stressful experience, but I'm glad that those kind of things are in place when people do find them. So what I wanted to ask next is, just thinking in terms of a bit of positivity, and what we wanted to ask is, what sort of things really make your day?
I think the number one bestest thing that makes my day is when I see a survivor succeed, when I see a survivor move forward, when I see a survivor maybe even leave the group or is no longer in need of support and assistance because they've got this now. I think that is, that's just amazing. It's like watching your child leave home, it's just such an amazing feeling.
Sure, yeah. Especially, as a professional, that I can understand why that would be very rewarding, and just seeing the help manifest itself in actual reality would be a very rewarding experience, I imagine.
Yeah, what you said it way better than I said. That was good.
And the last question I had for you today is, what words of empowerment or encouragement would you give to people with a brain injury?
First of all, never give up. Absolutely do not ever give up. Know that there's someone in your court. There's someone that's got your back. It's just a matter of finding that someone. And don't give up. It's just every day may be a challenge. It may be different every day, but keep going. There's the old self prior to the brain injury, and eventually you're going to make it down that path to embrace the new self. And that new self may be a little bit different, may not be able to do things the way the old self used to be able to do things, but it's okay, because this new self is going to just rock it. So it's important to embrace the new self, and not to ever think of yourself as disabled, because you are not. You are diff-abled with an F. You're differently abled. When
Absolutely.
the universe closes a door, it opens a window.
Yes, for sure. I think those are very powerful words. I think that, you know, everyone should probably take seriously, not just people with brain injuries. You know, it's important to be accepting of yourself and acknowledge your strengths and focus on what abilities you do have rather than the abilities you don't. So as you say, it's important to recognize that people are just differently. It's not about disability. This is just about what you can do. So thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights. We really appreciate it. And we also thank our audience for joining us this week. So please join us next week for our next video. All the best. Thank you.